Chapter 27. To ascend is human. To fall is also human. Shilian turned his head and asked, "What do you mean?" "The homeless street urchins of the imperial capital all run together in a gang, and they come to my neighborhood frequently to beg for food. I know all of them, but I've never seen this child before." That young child peered at Muqing and didn't say a word. Fengshen was doubtful. Who did they beg for food from? You? And you'd give it to them? Muqing glared at him. If they pester relentlessly, there's no other way. Fengshen still thought the notion rather unbelievable, but didn't make any further commentary. Oh. Watching their exchange, Shilian wanted to laugh. Besides, there are sewn patches on his clothes, Muqing added. Judging by the needlework, it must have been done by a grown-up sometime recently, so there's at least someone of age in his household. His family situation might not be the best, but he's definitely not a beggar. Shilian naturally would not notice the details of needlework on sewn patches, nor whether it was done by adults. But Muqing used to be an errand boy at the Royal Holy Temple, and he also did all kinds of chores at home. When Shilian looked closely, it was indeed as he had said, so he asked, "Do you have grown-ups at home?" The young child shook his head, but Muqing said, "There must be. If he doesn't go back, his family will surely be worried sick looking for him." No way, there's nobody!" that young child cried, sounding like he was afraid to be sent back, and he opened his arms reaching for Shilian. He was still covered with mud and blood, and Fengshen couldn't stand it anymore. "What are you doing, kid? Things were urgent earlier, so whatever, but shouldn't you know better by now? This is the Crown Prince. His Highness the Crown Prince. Do you understand?" The young child's arms immediately shrank back, but he was still gazing at Shilian. "My parents are quarreling and kicked me out. I walked for a long time but had nowhere to go." The other three looked at each other in dismay. After a moment, Fengshen said, "So what now?" One of the imperial doctors suggested, "If His Highness is troubled, he can be kept here in the palace and have a few attendants assigned to take care of him." Shilian contemplated, but after some thought, he shook his head slowly. At the end of the day, he was afraid Qirong wouldn't give up, and he'd sneak out to cause trouble. "The way I see it, it'd still be best if I watch over him until his wounds are healed. It seems his family won't be able to look after him, unfortunately. Fengshen, when you take care of the stalls that were toppled, when you took care of the stalls that were toppled by Qirong, send some men to see if his parents can be found, and let them know so they don't worry." "All right," Fengshen nodded. One of his arms was still in a sling, but he extended the good arm to reach for the young child, intending to pick him up by the collar. Shilian laughed. "You're wounded. Don't worry about it." However, Fengshen shrugged it off. "Only one arm is broken. The other's still fine. If both my arms were broken, I could still use my teeth to carry him by the collar and bring him up the mountain for you." Muqing rolled his eyes from behind him, then spoke up. "Don't bother. Let me carry him." But, just as he took one step forward, the child jumped off the bed himself and said, "I can walk on my own." That expression, set with resistance, spoke louder than words, and it made Muqing's second step extremely awkward, as he was unsure whether or not to proceed. The little kid had 5 broken ribs and a broken leg, but he was still bursting with energy. Shilian really didn't know whether to laugh or ache for him. He settled on saying, "Stop running around." Then he bent down and picked him up. The 3 of them left the palace with the child in tow. Since Qirong had caused havoc on the streets earlier, disturbing the townspeople and toppling a number of stalls, Shilian felt deeply guilty in that he had no face to meet any of the citizens. So the group slunk around, afraid to show themselves, using only the back alleyways. The entire way, the small child was extremely docile in Shilian's arms. They told him to be quiet, and he uttered not a single sound. Fengshen glared. This brat kicked me yesterday, but look at him now. He really knows how to pick 'em." "It's His Highness the Crown Prince. Of course he's liked more than most people," Muqing said. For some reason, even when he said something well-meaning, he'd still choose words that made people feel wholly uncomfortable. Fengshen didn't want to acknowledge him anymore. After walking for a while, Fengshen spoke up. "No, I still don't think your Highness should hold a strange child for everyone to see." "What's the problem?" Shilian asked. "You're the Crown Prince!" Fengshen exclaimed. When he spoke, he saw a worn-down handcart further up the alley and said, "Put the kid in the cart and pull it." Muqing immediately voiced, "Just so we're clear, I will not pull that thing up the mountain." "No one's asking you to," Fengshen said. He reached out and yanked the child from Shilian's arms, and the child started struggling again. Never mind, forget it. Maybe someone else needs that card, Shilian said. Just then, from somewhere nearby, someone suddenly called out, "Are you the Crown Prince?" Another immediately shouted, "Yes, yes, yes, that's the Crown Prince. His mask fell yesterday and I saw his face with my own eyes. That's him. Catch him." The three of them froze. Their hearts stopped. Although Shilian didn't think he did anything wrong at the heavenly ceremonial procession the day before, he also knew that others might not agree. To cut short the god-pleasing martial ceremony was an ominous sign of misfortune. It was taboo amongst the nobility, and when all the excitement wore off after the fact, and the people started to wonder what it all meant, they probably wouldn't be as forgiving either. Added on top of that, there was the havoc on the streets caused by Qirong earlier in the day. The complaints must be endless. If they were surrounded now, it might end badly. Before Shilian could dwell on it, Muqing grabbed him and shouted, "Your Highness, run!" Fengxin was pulling the cart and urged him to. "Your Highness, I have a broken arm. I won't be able to stop anyone rioting. Go!" However, outside the alleyway, there was already a mass of people who were pouring in, their faces filled with excitement, blocking all viable exits. The four of them had nowhere to run, and they watched as they were surrounded by countless pairs of wide eyes. Shilian braced himself and thought, "If anything, I'll just let them beat us down without a fight back." But unexpectedly, although the crowd poured in, it didn't pulverize them. Instead, a number of hands reached out and threw him into the air with cheers of, "Your Highness!" Shilian was thrown into the air multiple times, but still maintained his calm and composure. The people shouted, all talking at once, "Your Highness, that leap on the Grand Avenue of Divine Might yesterday was spectacular!" Someone praised in awe, "That was such an amazing jump! Really, I totally thought the Heavenly Emperor himself had descended. I had goosebumps!" Another validated him. "His Highness was right to say that, child. A life is a life. Do they think kids from our poor families are so different? If it were me, I'd do the same." Another raged, "That's right. Today there was talk of how His Highness had ruined the event, and I just couldn't stand it. If it had been a royal or a noble who had fallen, they wouldn't be saying those things. Your Highness, don't mind those people. His Highness is the one who truly cares about us." Shilian went from feeling guilty at the beginning to disoriented halfway through, until finally he was affected by the enthusiastic, cheerful faces all around. The crowd clustered around Shilian, and when they emerged onto the main street, more and more joined them. Fengxin, Muqing, and that young child were pushed away and separated, left a long way back without any way to get through, and they could only follow along behind the parade. This large assembly of people was surprisingly no smaller than the crowd from the day before. Every time Shilian made a move to leave, he was forcibly dragged back in and thrown into the air without any chance of being let down. Shilian couldn't help but find it both funny and reassuring, and he thought to himself, the people and the state preceptor have completely opposite sentiments. It looks like I was in the right. When they reached Mount Taikang, the setting sun was ablaze, burning strong as always. As they passed through the large entrance gates, they saw trainees and cultivators all along the long, winding stone path, carrying water buckets and firewood and running up and down the road. They greeted Shilian and company as they went, but many watched the four plus a cart and with wonder. Fengxin was pulling the handcart with one hand like a perfectly diligent young black bull. Shilian and Muqing laughed with as much restraint as they could muster at first, but since they couldn't change his mind, they stopped caring. The maple grove was vast, and the wheels turned steadily. As they hiked, Shilian helped push the handcart from behind. He was in a good mood and casually asked the child another question. "Little guy, what's your name, really? Hong what?" The child gazed at him attentively and answered in a small voice, I don't have a name." Shilian was taken aback. "Your mother didn't give you a name?" That young child shook his head. "My mother is gone." Sympathy sprouted in Shilian. "Then what did your mother used to call you?" The child hesitated for a moment, and then he replied, Hong Air. Shilian smiled. "That's a rather cute nickname. I'll call you that from now on." Hong Air seemed shy whenever they talked, and he kept his head bowed low. Dusk was approaching, and lights were ignited in the palace temples on each of the mountain peaks in the far distance. Among them, the brightest was, of course, the highest peak, the Divine Might Summit. Atop the Divine Might Summit, within the Palace of Divine Might, it was as bright as day, and the lights gathered like stars on the peak. Shilian sighed as he watched. The sigh wasn't born of sadness, but from scenery that emanated such beauty and magnificence. Every bit of light within the hall was an offered everlasting lamp. It contained Each lamp contained a devotee's most sincere prayers. The more everlasting lamps there were within the temple of a god, the more powerful that god. The chance to offer a lamp within the palace of divine might of the royal holy temple was difficult to buy even with 1,000 gold. Wealth, power, ability, passion, affinity, at least one of those 5 conditions must be fulfilled to enter the temple to offer light. Yet, there were so many in the world who had none of those 5. The 4 of them stopped, gazing spellbound upon the palace of divine might that shone like the sun, their expressions dissimilar. Just then, a somewhat familiar voice called out to them, "Your Highness!" Shilian looked back and saw a fair-faced young man hurrying toward him. It looked like the trainee who guarded the entrance of Xishang Palace, and Shilian composed himself. "Zhu Xishong, what's the hurry?" Zhu Xishong noticed Muqing standing behind him and felt awkward, so he spoke, pretending not to have seen him. "State Preceptor has been asking after you for a while. He's at the Palace of Divine Might right now, waiting for you." Shilian was taken aback hearing this, but he figured it had to be about the incident during the heavenly ceremonial procession the day before. "Very well. Thank you, Xishong." Shilian had Fengxin and Muqing take Hong Kong Air back to the Palace of Xinle, and he headed toward the Divine Might Summit. Outside the Great Hall, clouds born from the incense vessel floated and wrapped around the Palace of Divine Might, giving it a dreamlike look. On either side of the vessel, there were long rows of bright, everlasting lamps hung in the air in neat lines that made a wall of lanterns. Every everlasting lamp had the name and prayer of the light offerer inscribed in proper and dignified clerical script. Once inside the hall, there were rows upon rows of even more everlasting lamps hung on each wall. The lamps offered within the Palace of Divine Might were, of course, even more valuable than the ones outside. Inside the temple, at the very front, the chief state preceptor was offering incense before the statue of the heavenly emperor, and the 3 deputy state preceptors were behind him, uniformly prostrating before the divine statue. Shilian nodded when he entered. "State Preceptor." The state preceptors finished paying their respects before they turned to him and motioned for him to come forward. Thus, Shilian approached, took an incense stick, and also paid his respects with sincerity. It was a moment before the state preceptor finally spoke. "Your Highness, the 4 of us have deliberated. In regard to the heavenly ceremonial procession, there are but 2 ways to resolve the problem." "Please, do tell, State Preceptor," Shilian said. The first method, the state preceptor said, "is to find the child who disrupted the procession, and then we shall conduct a ceremony. At the very least, one of his 5 senses must be sealed as penance." Shilian's head shot up. "No," he then repeated definitively, "absolutely not." The state preceptor nodded. "I expected this response from you. So, we've put the weight of our consideration on the second method." "Please do tell," Shilian said solemnly. "The second method," the state preceptor said, "is to have your Highness publicly repent before the people of Xinle, ask the heavens for forgiveness, then face the wall in reflection for a month." "Not possible," Shilian said leisurely. The state preceptor was taken aback. "We're not really asking you to face the wall to reflect. You just have to look like you are." He suddenly remembered that they were in the statue of the heaven. What? They suddenly remembered that they were before the statue of the heavenly emperor and immediately corrected himself. "As long as you are sincere, it will suffice." Still, Shilian responded, "No." "And the reason?" the state preceptor asked. "State Preceptor, when I descended the mountain today, do you know what I saw?" Shilian asked. Not only did the people of the imperial capital not condemn the accident that happened during the heavenly ceremonial procession, they very much approved of it. This proves that the people of this kingdom all believe that the decision to save that child was right. If I were to do as you say and be punished for something correct, what would they think? Won't it only tell everyone that if we save a life, not only do we not obtain fortuitous merits, but will instead be punished for our sin? How should they think or act after that? "Whether it's right or wrong isn't important," the state preceptor said. "You must choose between the 2 paths. Nothing is perfect in this world. Either the child shoulders this blame, or you do. Right or wrong is very important. If I must choose, then I choose the 3rd path," Shilian replied. The state preceptor rubbed his forehead. "Your Highness, excuse my bluntness, but why do you care what they think? Today they think one way. Tomorrow they'll think another. There's no need for you to mind the small details. Trust me, people will carry on doing what they do. what they need to do and will not be touched by your actions, nor use you as an example. It's best if we focus on carefully serving the ones above. Shilian was silent for a moment, then spoke. State Preceptor, ever since I entered the Royal Holy Temple to become a disciple here, the more I train, the more I reflect. There's actually something I've always thought, but didn't dare to speak of. And what's that? The State Preceptor asked. Is it really right for us to worship and prostrate before the gods like this? The State Preceptor was speechless for a moment. If we don't worship the gods, then what are we to do? Go homeless? Your Highness thinks that the thousands and millions of devotees who come here to worship are wrong in their beliefs? Shilian shook his head and pondered for a moment. Then he said, their beliefs are not wrong. It's only that this disciple doesn't think it's right to prostrate oneself. He raised his head and pointed to the resplendent, scintillating great statue of the heavenly emperor. When humans ascend, they become gods. To humans, gods are elders, teachers, everlasting light. But they are not our masters. Therefore, we should be full of thankfulness and admiration, but never groveling worship. Just like the Shengyan Heavenly Ceremonial Procession, I believe the correct attitude is thankfulness and shared joy, not fear, not ingratitude, not intimidation, and certainly not putting oneself in a position of servitude. The State Preceptor remained poised and silent, but the other 3 deputy State Preceptors grew restless, turning their heads back. Shilian continued, an accident happened. It couldn't be helped. I'm willing to offer 1,000 lamps to brighten long nights. Even if this is an act of self-destruction, I am not afraid. But I refuse to bow my head for something I did right. Face the wall in reflection? What have I done wrong? What has anyone done wrong? It's like how Qirong committed evil, but Fengshen, who subdued the wrongdoer, had to be punished. Where's the logic in it? If the heavens have eyes, they will not condemn me for this. The State Preceptor cast his gaze elsewhere. Then, Your Highness, let me ask you, what if the heavens really do condemn you? Will you apologize then? If that should happen, then the heavens are wrong. I am right. I will stand against the heavens and defy them until the end. Illustration. Hearing this, the State Preceptor's face changed slightly, and he chuckled. Your Highness, you're pretty brave to say such words. The other 3 deputy State Preceptors watched him, wanting to speak, but hesitated. Just then, an alarm suddenly blared outside the hall, like the ringing of multiple bells at once. Now, none of the 4 State Preceptors could remain in their seats any longer, and they rushed out at the same time, dashing toward the back of the hall. Shilian followed close behind. They traveled through the many buildings behind the Palace of Divine Might until they came before a black pagoda. The doors to that black pagoda were open, and countless wisps of dark smoke whooshed out. The State Preceptor let out a despairing scream. Where's Zhu-an? Where the hell did he go? How did this happen? A number of trainee with watch guards rushed over, and the one leading was Zhu Shishong. State Preceptor, I'm over here! I don't know what happened! The door was perfectly locked, but it suddenly opened on its own! The State Preceptor pulled at his hair. Quickly, bring me a new soul-sealing jar! Shilian charged straight inside. Within the black pagoda, the walls were covered in latticed sandalwood panels of varying sizes and shapes, stacked unevenly atop each other. Within each panel were various clay jars, porcelain vases, jaded boxes, and so on. Each of those containers had originally been secure, the red stoppers stuffed firmly in place, the mouths sealed with yellow talisman inscribed with vermilion spells. But now, many were shattered. Many more continued to drop off the shelves by themselves, and those not yet fallen were wobbling. Each of those soul-sealing containers had a demon or ghost who once caused havoc sealed within. A black pagoda like this existed in the back of every single temple on Mount Taikang, utilizing the mountain's pure, saintly qi to keep them subdued. However, something had happened to cause this sudden insurgence, and they had all escaped. It's too late! Shilian shouted. He immediately kicked the doors closed. The seal lock that had originally chained up the door had been broken by the resentful spirits. So Shilian unsheathed his sword and used the tip to draw out some characters. then plunged it down. He'd brought over 200 swords with him when he arrived at the mountain, and he'd switched the one he carried on his person almost every day. Each was a peerless, singular, treasured sword. This sword, having been planted in the ground like at a slant, did indeed seal the door shut, never to be opened again. Only the sound of resentful spirits thrashing in rage within the black pagoda could be heard. Once they retreated from the black pagoda, they looked up, and atop each of the summits, black clouds were erupting from the black pagodas behind each temple. All the resentful spirits were rushing to the sky, and like rolling, thick smoke, they all flew toward the same place to gather. "What's over there? Why are they all flying over there?" Zhu-an asked. The state preceptor yelled, "Have you lost your brains? That's the palace of Shenle!"